We're
But
not like,
oh,
there
there
we
we
are.
go.
Hey,
Good morning, everybody, for the first panel of the day for Lit RPG Con, or for Guildify Con. We are on the E = MC squared panel, which is real science versus Handwavium, when to keep it accurate and when to say because magic or the wizard did it. We'll just go down the panel and introduce yourselves. Tell us a little about you and what you do. So we'll start with Rathwig.
hi, I'm Gabriel. I write Earth Online, Warrior Academy, I Am Gamer, From Chef to Crafter to Conqueror, and a few other standalone novels. Currently working on a 3-book series with Aethon Books, Mercenary Reincarnated as a Chef, and that's me.
Don?
Yep. Hi, I'm Dawn. I'm author of Space Seasons. I've been working on a new series for next year, which is Sci-Fi Progression. So I'm excited to talk about that today, hopefully.
Max?
Hi, I'm Maxwell Farmer. I am, I say animal here by day, author and dad by night. And I am, I've written the Dr. Druid Lit RPG trilogy, and I'm currently working on a cultivation progression series called The Last Scion.
Jeff?
Hey guys, I'm Jeffrey Falcon Logue. I am the author of Slime Dungeon, Bio Dungeon, Station Company Core, several others. I am currently working on my second, but my first solo sci-fi, Mecha Dungeon Apocalypse on Aurora Road currently. So really looking forward to this panel because of that, with all the giant robots and such. So take us away, Nick.
And I'm Nick Kuntz. I am a developmental editor for the genre. I've got 150 books under my belt. I've been with the genre since about the onset. Moderated a number of panels at different cons around the nation. So let's just dive into this. What are we considering Handwavium to the group as a whole? Go ahead, Gabriel. It sounded like you wanted to jump in right there.
Oh, I was kind of trying to get my thought together, but sure. So in my From Chef books, I start off with Handwavium to set the tone. And that is, there's a scene where the spaceship explodes and the escape pod is getting away from the spaceship. And something happens very sciencey, and I call it a Kobayashi Maru wave. Yeah. So hopefully anybody in the sci-fi understands right now that we are not in the realm of, hard science fiction.
Right.
So now you understand that because of this, pop culture kind of science meme, everything else is going to be a little bit less. Nobody's going to be eating food and defecating to make poop. You know what I mean? Or potatoes. You know what I mean? None of that.
Okay.
That's it. That's my start.
So, Don, what does Handwavium mean to you compared to hard science?
I do like a little bit of hard science in my sci-fi, so I do tend to do a fair bit of research. But for Space Seasons, because I do have giant mech which merge together, I kind of went with a slightly cultivation kind of magic system, which I called Kenosi, which they can sort of obviously get stronger in and then merge the mechs together, because technically you can't just merge metal. It just it kind of doesn't happen. So there is kind of some Handwavium with Space Seasons, but with some of the other sci-fi stuff, I do like to especially see what actually happens in space, what astronauts go through, just everything, just generally. But that's my Handwavium stuff.
Mm-hmm. Max?
I really constitute or kind of define Handwavium as not having a logical base to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's you can a lot of times with Lit RPG, it's okay, this much into your vitality equals this many health, in that kind of way. There's it's a pretty logical based kind of thing. And so I think sometimes it's where it defies that logic a little bit, where there's more of the subjective element that's really where I define it. And I mean, I think lit RPG is a really good genre for it because there definitely can be a lot of times there's a system, you know, usually sometimes it's even like it has a will of its own or something like that. And so a lot of times you can use that to kind of get away with some of those things because like the system is kind of playing to its own advantage.
Yep. What about you, Jeffrey?
So I think Handwavium you can treat a little bit different in fantasy compared to sci-fi. And I've had that experience, especially with the Station Company Core, where a lot of the mysterious dark science it's not so much Handwavium as in it works because it works, but it works but we don't understand why it works. And that's, you know, part of the plot with sci-fi, especially if you're going to cosmic horror or darker advanced civilizations. It works, we don't know why. And magic with fantasy it's the way I've written stories, it does sometimes come across as we don't understand why exactly it works, but it's more of like the peasant doesn't know why magic works, except they see the results.
Yep.
It's that famous quote that I cannot remember who said it, but any sufficiently advanced technology, you know, is magic to somebody who doesn't understand it.
Asimov or Clark, right?
Yeah, it was one of the two. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that actually directly ties into my next question, which is there's Handwavium in science fiction, and then there's Handwavium in fantasy and lit RPG. As lit RPG uses for the most part, a defined system where science fiction, Handwavium versus science is real world science. How does that affect how you write? Is Handwavium in a fantasy world more just the wizard did it? Or is it something that breaks your system? I'll let Jeffrey start with that one.
So, will Handwavium break the system? I'm going to talk about Biodungeon then. For those of you who are unaware, Biodungeon is my currently, I would say, my best written fantasy with Jonathan Brooks, and it is both an epic fantasy and then also it's a dungeon core with the dungeon perspective being inside the human body. I had to use my genetics major for something after becoming an author, right? So a lot of that Handwavium is the dungeon doing immunology shenanigans, and of course the human being like, why the heck can I suddenly do supernatural things without so much training or whatnot? And that it does bend the rules of the world a little bit, because it is a perspective on how magic works. I had to talk to Jonathan how exactly right is the magic working? Is it just doing things? Is it augmenting muscles? We had to have a couple of conversations about that. And despite all of this, the normal humans of the story have no idea any of this is happening. It's just working because it works. So I would say it's fun to have some Handwavium because the mystery is sort of the spice for the plot sometimes. And you could do the same thing with sci-fi. It often is like lost or unknown technology is that driving spice for the plot.
Mm-hmm. Max?
So I would say in terms of trying to differentiate sci-fi versus fantasy, and correct me if I'm wrong, it was kind of, you're asking about like if things can break the system, particularly with them.
Yeah, so if Handwavium in fantasy is more breaking the system you had written in your lit RPG versus breaking normal science rules and regulations in the real world for science fiction.
Okay. I would say I mean, for me in particular, I did not necessarily break the system. I used it in conjunction and enhanced kind of those things, because like Nick was nice enough to actually edit my Dr. Druid stuff, so he's familiar. But like my main character is a healer, and so he actually uses some real world medical applications in terms for like magical healing as well, like in potion crafting and stuff. I think in either fantasy or sci-fi, honestly, it can break the system. It just really depends on the origin of the system and how powerful it is. Because there are definitely genres out there. There are certain rules that the system like just isn't part of, whether that is like a couple that come to mind, or Primal Hunter has some of its own unique stuff. And the Road to Mastery that has some more sci-fi elements, and the system also has some stuff outside there. So there's definitely room in there. It just really kind of depends on how powerful you make the system to be.
Yeah. I mean, in your book in particular, so the actual real science was seen as magic by the people of the world they were in.
Yes.
Versus the magic he was doing. So yours was inverse for Handwavium, effectively.
Yes. Yes.
to the other people of the world.
Yes. Like when the vet made a transdermal medication to apply to his animal, and they're like, what is that? Yes, it's very abnormal to the elves of the world that I wrote.
Don?
It's very difficult to answer realistically. I think because I'm actually writing book 7 for Space Seasons now, and I've actually had to go back and literally work out like how the book's going to end within the system that I created for the mech, and in the sort of like the mech merge. I can't break it. I can't suddenly have like people joining mech merges that just, so all my science and all my kind of the way I added everything up right at the beginning has had to follow through right to the end, which is it's actually taken me like 3 weeks to just do the maths for my characters, because they kind of all have to come together to make the big mechs. So that the math and all the each mech has its own specific quantifiable things to add up, and so do my people. So like my characters can only power certain up to a certain level, and then they can't operate the mech. So everything had to kind of like just the science, sort of like little bits. It's not specific science because obviously it's still made up, but it's I can't break it in that term. So for the real science stuff, the spaceship stuff I've kind of kept really, that is pretty Handwavium. They've got space jumps. They use the magic to help propel the spaceships through space, because they're going to travel back to Earth, which technically took them 170 years the first time. They're going to try and do it in 40 days or something. So it's there's going to be some sort of at least system breaking in that sense, but that's me. Thank you.
Gabriel?
So I'm kind of reminded of a few different examples. Does anybody remember the movie Thank You for Smoking?
No.
So it was a movie about a lobbyist for smoking back in the 90s. And there's one scene where they're trying to get cigarettes back into movies. And they're like, we're going to put Brad Pitt and Catherine Zeta-Jones in space, and they're going to have sex in this zero gravity pod. And then they're going to light a cigarette up and they're going to smoke it. And then the guy goes, Rob Lowe's characters, and he goes, wait, wouldn't the spaceship explode in an all oxygen environment? And the other character, Aaron, I forgot his name, Aaron Eckhart, he goes, oh, we'll just write a line. Oh, thanks to the invention of blah, 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 we can smoke in space, And it's like that kind of Handwavium really works if you're like trying to put like a certain thing in a story, and you see it a lot. And I think that's one way to mix the hard science with Handwavium. And another thing I'm reminded of is last night or yesterday, we did a podcast and somebody asked if they should invent their own system of measurement in their book, like not use imperial or metric. And immediately I was just like, no. Stick to the hard science and use the any form that you want that we have, and just say, oh, the translation software did it, or you know what I mean. So like, there's little ways to make sure those combine. I know this is a little off the topic, but I couldn't think of a good answer that everybody else didn't give yet.
Yeah, no, that's great.
But the third thing I do is my books are a lot of alternative history, a lot of time travel alternative history. So like the current series from Chef Books, my character has a AI in his brain with all of human history's knowledge, right? So then you have all the science there. So if you really want to get into detail, I can explain how to make a crystal radio from scratch, you know, but I don't have to. So I can hand wave it after. I could do it once, and then, oh, now we built this radio, and it's kind of hand wavy because I did the hard science, and now it's, do you know what I mean?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, so.
Yeah,
and
that
yes, Arthur C. Clarke.
Yeah.
That's the quote. Yeah.
Yep. And that was going to lead in my next question. Is there a time and a place for both Handwavium and hard science in a book? Gabriel just kind of touched on that, specifically with distances and whatnot. But I think there's definitely places for other parts as well. What do you guys view as a book of fully science isn't going to hit the market for a lot of people? So where do you think that balance needs to be? And we'll go back to Gabriel with that one. I know he kind of just touched on it. We'll let him expound a little bit.
Wait, Max seems to be like.
Oh, Max is jumping in?
Yeah. I would say it is. I think the big thing with those things is thinking specifically what your magic does. Like you can't just say like he heals his wounds. It's more like, oh, he regenerates his wounds, or hey, this happens because of XYZ. Like it's kind of more specifically that there definitely, I believe, can be a very good mix of it. It's just knowing you can't just say because magic. You have to know what the magic does specifically, I believe. It's like, oh, they help to reconnect the muscle fibers or whatever. You don't necessarily have to explain everything, but as long as you know what that particular effect is, because you can't just go, boom, I touched him and it's all back. It's like, oh, I touched him and time reversed and the wounds came back, or whatever it may be. But just kind of having at least a more logical understanding of the powers definitely can allow for a good mix of fantasy and sci-fi, I believe.
So in regards to that, then you look at Harry Potter, who did the time turner, and they just spun the dial and they went back in time.
Yeah.
But then they also had to regrow bones.
Yes.
So
yeah, I mean, they that is a very good point in that way. But I mean, I guess, they did, and they mentioned this too about like making sure not to interact with their past selves to kind of change the paradox in that way, which makes sense in a logical understanding for me. And even like the growing bones. I mean, they gave a potion, and the potion was going to help the body to eventually regrow that. And so, like, again, it has enough logic in there that you don't have to go like, wait, what?
Okay.
In that way.
Okay. Good answer.
Yeah.
So I was thinking, there's certain things like as an author that we do, and hard science is one of those tools that we use that can really, really progress the whole book, and we're doing hard science the whole way. And when we do that, we really paint yourself into a corner. Because if you use so much hard science, like the Handwavium part is just super noticeable. And I was trying to come up with some examples of books at the end where authors really do that, and it's jarring. And I couldn't think of any off the top of my head. But I was thinking of examples of books that don't do that, and they keep the hard science, and it works throughout the book. And I think Daniel Wisniewski, Alpha Physics, is that right? Is that Alpha Physics? Or Dmitry Gurkis? There's two physics books. There's two physics lit RPG books. I can't remember the authors' names, but they both do a really good job of, one uses physics as a magical system throughout the book, and the other one uses computer programming language as the science for magic throughout the book. And I'm sorry, guys, if I know
Alpha Physics is Alex Kozlowski.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And then I think Dmitry has one that's he's German, and it's like based in Munich. It starts, and then the world post-apocalypse. And anyway, it's a good book. You check it out. Lit RPG. But they both do a good job of putting the science into magic, so that way you can use the science, but it's all magical. So there's the free form that they can play with it. They have the freedom to play with all the hard science that they want. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah. It does. I understand where you're going with that. Like setting the tone that there will be some hard science, but also setting the tone early that there was going to be some magic that's kind of unexplainable, but it's there to not make it jarring towards the end.
No. I mean more like you've taken the science and now it's magical. So you can use the hard science and it's interchangeable with either way. I don't know.
Nope. That I get that. That makes sense too. Yep.
But your way makes sense as well.
Don?
I was trying to think of examples like my own stuff, like how I kind of used fantasy and science together. I think for Tailspin, for the cyberpunk that we did, we had a sort of like fantasy elements where they did have potions and sort of like nanite packs that they could, sort of like kind of regenerate, as they say, sort of like, and heal, sort of like obviously the tech that they've got inside them. And it's still one of them where it's like you can't break the system within just because there's a bit of science, sort of like you still can't fly a helicopter that you're not qualified for, kind of thing. And I tried to bring in that kind of science and sort of like, because my next series is a little bit more sci-fi, I do go a bit deeper into sort of like the science for spaceships and sort of like how you fly them and some of the tech. I do have respawn pods. Bobby's going to start any second. So I do have respawn pods in my next series, but there's complications that come with it, because obviously you can't just regenerate a body. It's kind of like cloning, but isn't, because I still want to keep that soul element of the person. So there's a little bit of Handwavium, because souls and it's kind of, it's not just a downloadable mechanical brain. It's actually the soul of the person that is reborn into the sort of like the mechanics. Again, I like quantifiable magic switches, and that's why they get like a degradation with it. And there's you can only respawn so many times, and then shush, and then sort of like it's over.
Yep.
But so that's me. I'll mute myself before he starts again.
And Physics of the APOC is the Demetrius book. Thank you.
The respawn pod thing reminds me of that Robert Pattinson movie that's coming out. I don't know if anybody's seen the trailer for that, where like he goes into space, but he like as like a grunt that can be respawned, and there's like eventually more than one of them. I don't know if anybody's seen that trailer, but that's what it reminds me of.
I can see that. I haven't seen that trailer, but I mean it's got the Helldivers feel to it. Jeffrey, do you have anything to add?
Could you remind me what the question was?
It was how do you mix the two, and what is the proper balance between the two?
Okay. I already talked about Biodungeon, so I won't talk about that anymore. So me just as an author and also kind of as a person, but not as a reader, strangely enough, I like just having cause and effects. I like this causes this to happen. I like the logical steps when I'm writing. Even if I'm making up magic, there are the system, right? What Lit RPG is known for. The systems I've created have a clear, if you do this, this will happen in pretty much all of my writings. So even if I'm writing about unknown things, even if I'm writing about weird magic, just dungeons, for example, I like having just something that's foundational level. Like in my dungeon universe, mana stones are the crystallized form of mana. Then a higher version of that is a soul stone, which can hold a soul And then the higher level of that is a dungeon core. And that's why they are sentient and sometimes even sapient in what they create and what they do. Like there's just that clear connection. If I'm going to have Handwavium, generally I'm going to either use it for comedic purposes, for darker purposes, or finally as character development,
Mhm.
learning and whatnot. The book I'm writing right now, the Mecha Dungeon Apocalypse, has been my strongest realism, let's just call it. Just looking up technologies and research into giant machines and how they could potentially work. Naturally, I'm not going to, I'm creating a fictional thing, so it doesn't have to be 100% correct. It can't be 100% correct. But, if I want a battery that can theoretically hold this amount of charge, that can power this amount of things, like Gabriel was talking about with measurements earlier, I want the physics to make sense. I want something for the audience to be able to relate to in all of this insane fantasy sci-fi stuff, that they can easily connect, recognize, and accept all the shenanigery.
Yeah. It's a great word. So then that leads to the next question that I have. How much of this is, so for those of you that are pantsers versus hard outline writers, I know there's at least one full-on pantser in here. That would be okay. 3 of you. How does being able to give some Handwavium in the story get you out of some writing walls that you've written yourself into? Versus a hard outline and a hard and fast system that you can't Handwavium anything out of. Does, being that you haven't prepared for some of that, does the Handwavium help the pantsing portion?
I'll go first this time.
Sounds good.
I like the Handwavium whenever I'm doing a book one. I generally have just like a general outline of what I kind of want to happen, what the main character is, but everything else just comes as I'm writing the story. Other characters, minor events in the story, usually large parts of the system of however the world is governing. And I prefer that because it lets just the creativity flow. I'm not hampered so much by rules and regulations that I've already created. But while I'm writing the first book, as I come up with, I think that's a good idea, yada, yada, I make my world Bible. So just my side document of like how magic or how technology works, years, like who's in charge, who has companies. And from there, the further books usually have less of the Handwavium because I refer to that world Bible. But I think it's very important to have as little limits to your creativity as possible whenever you're writing your first book. And you don't ever want to fully constrain yourself. For instance, the Mecha Dungeon Apocalypse that I'm writing, I had to limit myself accidentally because I said wireless signals will attract bad guys. And naturally, I can't, send out scouts and do all this and the other. And somebody on Rural Road said, hey, what about point-to-point communication with lasers? And it's like, oh, that exists. So now in my editing, I can go back and I can allow for more interesting things to happen because I'm no longer restricted by that accidental limit I placed on myself.
I'll go next. Simply put, yes is how I would answer the question. I would say that there are times, I outline and then I say I'm a hybrid. I outline and then I really kind of let the story kind of develop naturally as I'm writing it. And sometimes some interesting idea or concept or something happens and I'm like, I didn't think about this. this or XYZ.
Mhm.
And so then, yes, it's more work, admittedly, where I have to go back and kind of like, oh, this, and this is this. But yes, it is kind of this more straightforward answer that yes, sometimes Handwavium can accommodate for some particular things, but you have to also make sure and go back so it doesn't look like, oh, he just thought of this last minute.
Right.
That's what you wonderful dev editors are there for. And so, but yes, that's kind of my take on it, my 2 cents on that.
Don?
For me, I'll talk about Tailspin because I actually spent probably we originally came up with the concept, the four of us, to work together on this cyberpunk world probably 12 months before we actually started writing it. So a lot of my initial research was into flying helicopters. I really wanted to go fly one, but couldn't find anywhere that would take me. I looked at getting there's play games, everything, things like that. So I spent a good 12 months listening to audiobooks from all the different wars over the years, like real research into actual helo pilots and flying and stuff like that. Because the story itself that I wanted to write was going to be a lot slower than my usual stuff, which it is because it's more a slice of life. It's like how he sort of progresses through his, learning to fly. Even, it's, you can't just hand wave that. You have to actually physically do it. So I spent, just literally hours walking and listening to books. But for me, the sort of like, there's no fantasy side to that. So I couldn't wave over it. And like going into the sci-fi, which I wrote from November, getting over sort of like the last 12 months of my life was really difficult. And so I decided that I wanted to completely write a book, which was for me. I didn't plot anything out. I literally saw one of my friends put a pre-made cover up, and I was like, that's it. That's the one I'm going to write. And I just dove into it in November. I had about 10,000 words before I started sort of like seeing what people thought of it. And I just pantsed the whole first 140,000 words in November. I actually got November off last year, so like of all my audio stuff. So for me, it was just completely pantsed right through. It's a lot more space opera progression, and I have gone back through and made sure all the science and all the spaceship stuff adds up, and because it was a lot of like Jeffrey says at the first book, it was just pure inspiration just to write it and just get it out of my system, and that's what I needed last year. So, well, that'll be publishing next year with a new publisher, Chris Kennedy, and I'll drop a link later for you.
Perfect. Anything to add, Gabriel?
What was the question again?
So does the ability to Handwavium some magic systems get you out of some that you've put yourself in due to pantsing?
Right. Nothing really. Yes, it does. Yes, it doesn't. As a pantser, you're pretty lucky, like Jeffrey says. You can, as a pantser, your freedom to take the story wherever you want is really there. So like you don't have to hand wave it unless you want to. Now in the later books, you have to be really careful because when you hand wave, it comes back and bites you in the butt. And that's why I noticed like the further you get in your series, I should do it this way. The further you get in your series, the harder and the more you have to pay attention to the little line you put here. Oh, this blah 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 doesn't work because of blah, and now you want to do it here. So yeah, it's a really helpful tool. But as a pantser, I think we're lucky that we don't have to rely on it so much. Whereas like if you plot your entire book out and you have a outline for everything and you hit a snag and you got a hand wave there, like you have to adjust your whole outline. For me, I'm like, I know where A and Z is, and B to Y I can play with however I want, So I don't know.
No, that's a great interpretation on that. A great take on that. Being that we don't have any hard outliners here that,
Somebody call Ramon.
Yeah.
or Dakota.
Yeah, Dakota.
So we've kind of discussed the real world science is more prevalent in science fiction than fantasy because it takes place more in the modern / futuristic actual Earth. With a lot of these books being written going to other worlds or other worlds being integrated into Earth. How much of Earth science are you really using versus their versus science that you can make up about their worlds? Which isn't necessarily Handwavium. I'm just going to say that that's their science. That's how their world works, right?
Yeah.
So
no.
Yeah. Go
That
ahead.
is, gosh, I feel there's a lot of room you could play around with. I mean, just like I think a classic example I think of is the Mars, it's not a lit RPG. It's the they made that movie, the Disney movie, about
John
a decade
Connor?
ago. John Connor, or not John Connor, but
Total Recall?
no, the one where he dies. Like it's a remake of it. It's like an old novel that they had.
John
Carter. John Carter.
Mars. Yeah,
Yeah.
John Carter. Yeah,
John Carter.
Mars. Yeah, John Carter.
I think of that as kind of a really classic example, like because they use the different gravity kind of to explain how he is so overpowered comparatively, and so there's definitely room in there. Like different places can have different metals, which can have different properties, different gravitational fields, XYZ, and there's a lot of room to play around. I feel most people still use kind of similar Earth's logic in a lot of ways, and it's probably just because it takes a lot of time to dedicate to kind of talking about all the differences that could be in there. I think it definitely can be done, but it's not one of those things that it's just it can be a minor element. It would have to be a major element, talking about everything on there. Now, if somebody's like going from planet to planet with different rules and stuff, totally. But I think if you have like more of like a, going to a central place or going even back to Earth and kind of referencing things using similar things, as I said, like metal ores, but then applying different properties and stuff like that, I think definitely have a place. But I do also think that there are ways that you can really incorporate a lot of unique variances that may be more towards in the sci-fi, lit RPG track, versus I'm more of a fantasy person personally. But there's definitely, I think, a lot of room to play around. But the John Carter one really kind of comes to mind initially.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. What's coming to mind? That Robotech, like original 70s Robotech, Macross.
Yep.
F-14 Tomcat, alien tech turns into a mech fighter, right? So you're blending the knowledge of this, the time, the most advanced military fighter in the world. People know about this, flies, and they have the Earth battles, and it flies as its plane form. And then you have the alien tech, and now you're a mech and you're in space. So all the science you have, gravity and Earth, all that stuff makes sense. Because if you read the books, it talks about this, if you read the original books. And then you go into space, and now the Handwavium appears, but you're in because they built the craft that you know about, and they talk about the science of the fighter, and now you go into space. So I think that's like a pretty cool way that integrates them together, and you have that Handwavium tech, and then obviously go Super Macross, go into space, blah 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 blah.
Yeah, similar to Will Smith in Independence Day with the fighter jet to the alien vessel, to kind of leading your reader along that Will knows what he's doing, so he can do this, and we can kind of break those earthly bounds.
And you stink.
Anything done?
What was the question again? I was going to say that. No, no, I'm joking. Okay. No, literally, kind of like for me, it's like, I for the new series, I worked with Michael Chatfield on a series which we had really hard sci-fi, traveling distances from planet to planet, and there was a lot of stuff that went into that series in the background. And for the new one, I kind of didn't want that on the science side. So although I've got Sol involved, and there's no other planet in our solar system mentioned. I just completely made up my own planets, the distances and stuff and things like that. But they still have to kind of get from one place to another, obviously. So build spaceships, and building spaceships is, it takes an awful long time and it's expensive. So there's so many things that I put through which have sort of like, and I tried to work out sort of like how much food would cost to feed a fleet in 100 to 200 years. And I based and worked maths all around things like that, and fleet costs and fighting, because I mean, even just general naval sort of like costs now are astronomical. So imagine the price in the next, and building things that are like 10 times as big. But that's my science for and not breaking it again on that side. So that's,
yep.
There you go. that's
I'd say when it comes to, once you start getting into the nitty gritty of other planets and everything else, I think there's a real chance that an author might be tempted one way or another to jump the shark, so to speak. You can go way too much into like the fine details and lose control of pacing and everything else. Or, you could just wave it off and then your audience has nothing to connect to. It's kind of like Dungeon Core originally, that all the dungeon stuff I ever read before I published mine as the first one was way too slow and boring after a while. Pacing was bad, or it was too fast and they got overpowered and the story was done. So just bringing in other planets, you have to reframe, I think, your big picture of the story, because once you have more than one planet, it's like just any map, right? You can focus any map like this big on a country, on a state, on a region or a town, right? Like the magnifying glass effect. You don't want to be talking about your local supermarket when your story is based in an entire galaxy.
Right.
For the, otherwise you sort of lose track of scale.
So that effectively leads into my next question on how much of the real science do you actually show and why? So is it more for the familiarity and the feel of the reader to just kind of be engrossed, or do you want to go super in depth into the crunchy side of the actual science, which I know there's a market out there for? I know some mainstream science fiction, there's readers who won't read it unless it is crunchy and absolutely down to the T what physics is. So where do you guys like to draw that line?
I can start with a practical example if you guys are up for it.
Yeah, go on.
In sci-fi? No.
Kind of. So just a practical example of, this, I say it works versus it doesn't work, is, for instance, I have my sword here that I made. It's a single piece of hickory wood. And, you can hold it like a tonfa and fight with it. And I've always had fun with it. And it's going to be in my dark urban fantasy. But then I had the real version commissioned. So now it's a real sword and everything. And the weight is just terribly different. Like, this sucker is heavy. You have to use it two-handed. You can use it like a bayonet for stabbing and whatnot. But this changes, I need to write how this weapon is used differently because of the real world physics and everything else. Go ahead, Gabe.
I was blinded by the sword and I forgot what I was going to say.
It's okay. I can go on.
Go ahead, Max.
I would say that it depends on, honestly, it depends on the type of story. I would say it's kind of a cop out in a way, but it depends on the type of story again. And so, like, what type of main character you're following in that kind of way. And so I will just personally use my Dr. Druid trilogy again as an example in that way. Like, he's a very logical character and approaches healing in a logical way. But then it's like, oh yeah, there's the magic element. And so I think it's trying to find the right blend. Because I mean, personally, at some point I will phase out if it's too detail heavy. That's just my own personal take. But enough in there, like, oh, that's really interesting. So I would say enough in there to give a semi-thorough explanation, but not going down to the cellular component. Like, oh yes, and this is doing that, and the mitochondria is powering the cell and doing this. I don't need to go that in depth, but yeah, like I can say, like, oh, it's helping to boost the body's regenerative properties, and it's actually helping to regrow XYZ. Like that, I think can be enough. But I think it is dependent on the type of story and the type of character that you have.
Does your Dr. Druid have a late night talk show with Adam Carolla, and did they take advice on things? So, picking back up what you said, it really does depend on the type of story, right? Like if you set, and it's expectations at the beginning, and you have to set those really early, because hard sci-fi people are like romance readers.
Yeah.
If you like historical romance, you like Victorian romance, not late period Gilded Age romance. So if you like hard sci-fi, you want statistics, and you want to make sure this better work. And if it doesn't work, they stop reading, and now they're looking.
Yeah.
What did you not get right? Well, I enjoyed the story until this point, and then da 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 da, and he didn't do this, and he didn't do this, and he didn't do this. But then if you set the expectation before, okay, oh, it's not hard science. So I don't have to tear this guy apart for, using the wrong font on describing this specific, scientific theory. You know what I mean? Those expectations are just everything. And super materials do change that, Jeffrey.
I'm just going to say, kind of go with that as well, really, because my new series is a lot more sort of not a specific market, but it's more Navy based. So I have to kind of stick. And my publisher is actually ex-Navy. So, and it was like, and he pulled me up on so many little tiny things. He's like, no, you can't. No. And I was like, okay, that's fine. And I actually learned quite a bit between different sort of like, obviously I'm not military trained. I have to put lots of research into my things. So that side of it, and I kind of riff off a bit at the start of the next series because some sci-fi books call it a bridge, and it's like for Navy, they don't, it's like, and it's certain things, and it's like you have explosions in space, and you don't have fire, and there's no sound, and you have to have other alert systems because you can't hear nothing, and it was really good to sort of like really bring in the sci-fi for that series. But like my other series, I don't do a lot of that. I stick to, with Space Seasons, I stick to a couple of little tiny sort of like no sound in space, no fire in space, and kind of things like that. But again, I try to stick to more sci-fi based than fantasy because I don't really like to hand wave. And when you do hand waving stuff, it's like that's when you get people that will start, oh, she's got this wrong. What else didn't she get right? And then they do pick it apart, and that's when they do mention it in reviews and stuff. And some of my best compliments for Tailspin was actually the amount of detail in flying helicopters. They're like, are you a helicopter pilot? And I'm like, no. I would have loved to have been, but I did not fly a helicopter. And they're like, it sounded like you did. And that's the kind of compliment that I want because I put the research in. So
yep. So we've touched on some of the things that are pretty common knowledge across reader expectations with distances. We just kind of touched on the military aspect of things. Are there other aspects of science fiction and fantasy that you see that are pretty much in every book that doesn't need to be explained, but is hard science?
I mean, material science, chemical reactions, just having basic fire working sort of frames what readers can expect about how your world works.
Mm-hmm.
S.M. Sterling in Dies the Fire, his book starts, it's a alternate universe kind of thing where all of a sudden gunpowder stops working. The chemical reaction that lets gunpowder work stops working. And that's the vessel for change. and so uses everything else still works, but not gunpowder. Not the, and it's more complicated than that. It's not gunpowder. It's just the explosiveness. Like you can't use gunpowder. You can't like burn fuel like gasoline. You know, things like that. There's some kind of something happens. That he explains it with solar flares and such. But then you set the tone now, and you have the science he does use is all practical science, building levers and dikes and things like that, making bicycles, stuff like that. So I mean, that's kind of one way to do it, where you have the hard, you put the explanations in there for why.
I would say as well, just to what everybody's kind of been saying too, like it. I think there are a number of things, and I feel most, I mean, a lot of lit RPG stuff starts on Earth, and so I feel there's a lot of things you don't have to have an explanation for. Like this thing fell from the sky because of gravity. You don't have to necessarily like, oh, you know what, and obviously if things are different, but I mean, like a lot of people are going to like, yeah, if you drop a bowling ball if a bowling ball falls from the plane, it's gonna crash. I think there are a number of things that you don't have to explain. I think it's whenever there is I guess it just depends on how much you want to affect change in that way. I think from a previous question though, talking about like other planets and stuff, there's definitely room for that. I feel it can get a little bit sometimes lost in the weeds if everything is different, like, oh, the sky is green, the water's pink, the ground is purple, and going in that way. But I think at least initially, I don't think you have to explain a lot of the natural rules. It's like, yeah, fire burns, unless there's a specific thing that you are intentionally making abnormal, like, no, this fire heals.
It's also really get caught up in it when you start. If you start doing it, you keep doing it with, like you go, oh, I'm gonna explain how they breathe, and let me explain how they, what I mean, it snowballs.
You jump
It's
the
like
shark.
They have gills,
Jump
and
the
you just
shark.
leave it at that.
Right. And the gills breathe 2 times per second every other 3 seconds, and then the amount of oxygen that
Yeah.
I think
Hi,
that's
this is
what
my dissertation. Weren't you an author?
I think that's why I wanted to write kind of like the space opera progression, not so much the nitty-gritty lit RPG kind of stuff. So it's easier for him to go in and get uploaded information to his brain to learn how to fly the spaceship basically and progress through the ranks. And I wanted that more than anything else, because our genre for the sci-fi side of things, we haven't kind of reached the people I think we need to reach, which is another reason why I've gone with Chris Kennedy for publishing, because he's worked with a few of my friends, as well as I think they've got sort of slightly progression fantasy stories already on the books, and I'm kind of thinking that we kind of, to reach that, we want the harder science stuff, so I've gone in a lot deeper, but even though classed it as progression, not lit RPG, because there's still stuff that I've done in the background that makes sense for me that isn't in the books, but anybody else can see that just by reading it. That's how I feel about it.
Mm-hmm. So Paul made an interesting comment in the chat of, I feel like fan theory, when things aren't explained fully, can be fun. What are your guys' thoughts on fan theories on your works? Do you read them? Do you enjoy them? Does it kind of integrate into what you're going to use later on at all?
I enjoy it. There's a really cool guy, Andy Murphy. He's pretty active in a lot of the groups, and he'll message me and sometimes talk about stuff, or even like send me pictures and like, oh, this reminds me of this. And it's pretty fun. Sometimes they think of things that I'm like, I just kind of made this like one little subtle reference, and I had kind of forgotten about this. And so it definitely can be fun. I don't do it necessarily. I mean, yes, there are times in books we'll write where we try to keep it intentionally vague. But I don't do it where it's like, I'm going to let the fans stew about this. And so it can be really fun. It's kind of an unintended bonus for writing.
I agree. at the risk of sounding pompous and smug, art is up to interpretation of the, perceiver. And I think it's hilarious when I get an email and they're like, "Hey, when you did this, you meant this, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure,
For you, I did.
that's exactly right, 100%." Man,
Nice.
you and I. No, seriously, it's great. It really is great. The having fans is awesome, and then the engagement and being able to write back and stuff. It's actually pretty interesting. And a lot of the times they do say something. You're like, "Oh, yeah, that is right. I think that makes sense," because you're trying to flesh a character out and you don't think about it, and then they might say something. You're like, "Oh yeah, I could, yeah, it works out. I could do that. Okay, thank you. I did not know what to do with that person. I was going to kill them. All right." So.
I think for me, it's I get a lot of comments mostly on my characters, so I get a lot of people guessing more like what my characters are going to be doing than sort of like theorizing other things. And it's for the fan side of things, it's like they mention things like literally the chapter before, and I'm like, but you're going to find out next chapter, and it's just so exciting. And especially like with the audiobooks, it's like people are listening to it. I'll get messages because I'm in the UK. So through the night, I'll get messages on a Discord or Facebook, and they'll literally be listening to the book, and I'll wake up to a morning of a slew of messages of their experience as they sort of like going through the books, and that absolutely makes my days. And fans are absolutely worth every penny.
I vaguely remember sending those messages at some point in time.
Yes, I get quite. Nick is actually one of my characters in Tailspin, who I will just add actually has just been nominated for a Sovas Award, which is Nick's actual death scene in Tailspin.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Because he
good job dying, Nick.
So my narrators absolutely nailed that scene, and that was the scene I submitted to it, which would nominate it for. So anyway, shut up.
I can't really think of any fan theories I've ever gotten for anything I've written before. I've got a lot of people
so good at breaking it down. They just know. They just understand.
I guess I've had
zero room for interpretation.
I've had people ask me for are you going to write more, and is this and that going to happen? But I've never had anybody say, "Hey, because of this, does this?"
Okay.
I have gotten a little bit more on the video game that I'm making. To answer Joe, the writing research has helped a lot because I'm making the game without any dialogue because the main characters are slime, so no talking.
Mm-hmm.
But the honestly, most of this comes from conversations I've had with my father. He enjoys reading, and he also enjoys asking questions. So often it can make for a pleasant, if I ever have to drive somewhere with him, it makes for good road conversation.
Very fair. We are at about the 2-minute to end mark. Go ahead and give us where we can find you, who you are again, and what your next project coming out is. And we'll start with Gabriel.
All right. Hey guys, this was really fun. Thanks for letting me participate. I had a good time. I'm Gabriel Rathweg. You can find my stuff all on Amazon. I am an Amazon exclusive. And my current series is From Chef to Crafter to Conqueror. Book 5 just came out on the 15th of October. It's about a chef from the Space Force in the future, gets sent back in time to medieval Japan and fights off the Mongol invasions of said country, Japan. The next thing I got is a series with Athon Books coming out in the holiday season, I hope, called Mercenary Reincarnated as a Chef. Kind of a similar theme, but it's a mercenary who isekai'd to a fantasy world. And I'm really excited about it. It's a tower climber. It's a food slice of life. It's pretty fun. So anyway, thanks a lot, guys.
Don?
So I'm wrapping up Space Seasons for next year, as well as publishing a new series with a new publisher who I signed with this year. It'll be coming out February, March, and April. I'm also in the process of having the audiobooks recorded, which I am editing myself because I'm an audio engineer. They'll also be simultaneously released, which Neil Thorne has done for me. And I really think he's a new narrator that's coming into the scene for our genre and for sort of like, he just for sci-fi in general, and one to watch out for. So that'll be me for next year. I've got a full year planned again, which never seems to stop for me.
Right. Max?
Yeah, I will keep it short and sweet. I'm Maxwell Farmer. I've written a completed lit RPG trilogy, Dr. Druid. Please check it out. I'm currently working on a cultivation progression fantasy series, Last Scion, out on Amazon and Audible today.
Perfect.
Hi guys, Jeffrey Falcon Lowe. You can find all my stuff on Amazon. You can find the book I'm working on now, Mecha Dungeon Apocalypse, on Royal Road. And you can find my video game demo, which just came out on Steam, called Slime Evo.
Awesome. And the next thing going on for Guildify Con is a takeover by Matt Herman at 11:15. So hang out and enjoy that, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Good times.